This roundtable is about open source or free software, and it's software between values and value. So I have several questions, but and I will open up the microphone. If we can have a mic for the room for later, so we should have 10 minutes. Maybe I should, instead of asking questions, ask Stéphane or Benjamin, those who haven't had the opportunity to speak yet, if they have any feedback or any comments on the previous speech or on the themes. Starting with, who wants to get started? Stéphane.
Well, first of all, thanks very much for the invitation, also for the excellent talks we had this morning. It's really quite interesting to see the evolution. And as someone who was involved in the open source and free software community since the early 90s, I'm very, very pleased of all the work that has been done by all these people, and also as an entrepreneur, as someone who has founded a couple of companies based on open source, on what we still call some open source business models, but also some values. We think that we need to stop a little bit and to think about what how important these values are for the success of a company. And I see two major points. The first one is internal to your company. It's really, as you can learn in every management book or lecture, that it's important that your employees share the values of the company. So you have to be very careful about what kind of values, and especially open source or values that are somehow related to open source, such as openness, transparency, consensus, you want to promote inside your company, and which kind of people you want to hire to work in your company, so that the values are still shared by all your employees. And the second part, of course, is all these values are projected toward the market, to your customers. So do your customer value your values? If they don't, maybe you won't have a great commercial success. So you have to also adapt, and you have to also tell the market to evangelize the market about open source. So that's what these great organizations have been doing for the last 20 years. And that's one of the reasons we are so successful, at least as open source companies. At pure open source companies, I'm not talking about the third phase that you highlight in your presentation, which is big companies that have very different business model, that maybe don't share that much the values that we are discussing. But as a second wave, as the professional open source or commercial open source company founder, we are really we think this is a very important question.
Okay, so your point is that companies that leverage an open source business model, or implement the business models that benefit from the possibilities offered by the open source licenses and the sharing of code, etc., to align with what Simon's was, to be precise. These companies really carry these values. They're not just opportunistic companies that try to benefit from
that's an important discussion that we, as a community, need to have. We all know some companies or some people that claim they share our values, or that claim even some claim they are doing open source, and actually it's not. It's what some people call open source or false open source. But so it's a different point. There's the values, and then there are ethical consideration on how to separate the grain from the chaff, if you
Thank you.
If you want.
Benjamin, yeah, a word.
Thanks. I think I was yesterday at another event, which is Congrès Curie, I don't know if you know it. It's an event which aims to gather all people from lawyers and people from valorization from research centers from all the France. And I spoke about la loi pour une république numérique. I don't know if this law is you are familiar with it. It's a 2 years ago law which aims at helping with improve open data within administration and ask all research centers to use by principle open data and open source in all of their projects. They have to think about open source, and sometimes they can just do proprietary software. It's really new for them, and the point was, how can they evaluate what they are doing? How can they gain money from software if they have to do open source? And I think it's always the same topics we are speaking about from years. Everybody knows that free doesn't mean gratis, but now we have to look for some metrics and to help them to understand that even if they are doing open source, they are doing good stuff, and they can just evaluate everything they've done with maybe new metrics, very specific from open source development methods. And my point is we have to think all together about the best methodology to evaluate it. We can, I think, one thing very new. Everybody should know software heritage from INRIA. So the big project led by Roberto Di Cosmo. This kind of projects help us to understand how our projects are used by people all around the world. We can try to automatically say, okay, even if it's open source, we have, I would say, 1 billion users. And maybe it is something very interesting for your organization, your research centers. And we have tools, I think about Bitergia, but we have lots of other tools which, by using such data, can help us to understand what is the value of our software. And maybe by combining both new kind of data like software heritage and new tools like Bitergia, there are other tools, and with a right methodology, we can say, okay, you're an organization from public or private sector, but doing open source is something right for you, and it's something you can just evaluate. You can gain money. You can just show your that for your can be the state or other people, but you can show that even if you are doing open source or free software, it's something good from an economical perspective.
It's interesting because you tend to, I mean, there is one way to defend open source towards mainstream and conventional decision makers is by highlighting the pragmatic benefits of open source. And I think we're losing the thing in a way. I think this is an unfortunate development. If you read, I mean, some of the Richard Stallman things, he defends the right to freedom, and the freedom is something about ethical values. So we have ethical values that are no economic value per se. I'm not talking about an equal value, but sharing, and he used the word friendship, about supporting the community, and this sort of advantage that have no cost. You don't put any pragmatic advantage. And yet, a few years later, when you read The Cathedral in the Bazaar that you've mentioned, Eric Raymond mentioned, and I think it's page 65 of the edition I have, I've been checking this, he describes a world, a Darwinian environment, ecosystem, where the developers are not working for freedom or for the benefit of the community. They work for reputation, for scratching an itch, because I need this, and I have my reputation. So it's very Darwinian, in fact. So there is no, I'm losing the sense of ethics and value there. So what, you've been around from, you have this perspective. So what do you think of this?
Is this working? It is. So it turns out that you can't be a free individual without freedom. And that to do all of those things that Eric Raymond writes about in The Cathedral and the Bazaar, and by the way, I don't support very many of Eric Raymond's political or philosophical positions, I have to tell you, despite being his successor as OSI president. In order to be able to be that individual developer scratching your own itch, you need freedoms. And the reason I assert that if you want to apply open source to a new problem, you need to go back to your moral compass, is because there is a hierarchy of needs and philosophies here. And without the fundamental freedom to use and to study and to improve and to share the code, you're not in a position to scratch your own itch.
But I think there is absolutely no moral issue in what Eric Raymond writes.
No, well, that's
about scratching your own itch and building your own reputation. This could be totally immoral.
But when you try and do it on that basis, you find you fail, because it turns out that you can't be free without freedom. And Eric is somebody who has an extreme right-wing point of view, who doesn't believe that there is such a thing as society. I fundamentally disagree with him. I think there is such a thing as society. But I don't believe it so strongly that I believe there is only society. I believe that we are developers living in society. And we have to find that balance. We have to guarantee, I want my freedoms guaranteed so that I can participate in society. I want my freedoms guaranteed so that I can build my reputation, so that I can build the software that I need. I don't think there's a conflict here, but experience shows that if you forget values, you fail at pragmatism. Pragmatism takes having values as a precondition.
Was Ericsson making the decision to open source Erlang with any hint of ethical values behind this decision?
I don't know. Sorry, I can't help you there, but at that time I was working on the technical team, and we did not know how you could get Ericsson to make Erlang open source. That was very much Jane who came in for it, who convinced them that it would be a benefit to them as a benefit for developing Erlang and the system around it, which they were using, they still are using in products, and it would not cost them anything, both in time and responsibility or something like this for as well.
As it happens, I spoke to Jane about it last week in Stockholm. Yeah. And yes, Jane is very passionate about building society. And her view, today she's an entrepreneur in building, she's creating startups and investing in them. And she is very motivated to create a fair society. By the way, her approach to her entrepreneurship, she is very critical of money-grabbing VCs and their tendency to marginalize good-natured geeks. That seems to make her very angry. So I would say, yes, that was part of Jane's motivation.
Yeah, I'd also say it could be very different for a private person, like myself as a private person, who wants to get their software out in the world, and for a company. If a company feels that their software is private in the sense that if they were made open source, then other companies could use it in their products as competition to it, then of course they won't, because that would cost them to do that. And I think that was one of the points I was trying to stress here, that seeing Erlang and the system around it has nothing to do with telecoms as such, giving it away or giving it out would not cost them anything in that sense. There was none of their products in it. Right? And getting back to the having open source for as a private person, as a way of increasing your fame or whatever you want to call it for it. Yes, definitely. I mean, I do open source software, and I've got no discussion about doing it. And I don't have any qualms of doing it, but I very much like to have a nice license which says if people use it, they can do whatever they want with it. But I still like to have my name there, saying so they can so people can see that they're using my stuff, right? And I'm definitely, of course, it's open source, so it's not going to cost them anything as such, apart from just including the license.
Max, to get back to the expression, Simon's expression of moral compass, which echoes with my questioning about whether these moral values or ethical values in open source are getting lost. The FSFE is probably, among all us here, the organization that is probably the strongest promoter of ethical values. I mean, or the one that relies most more on ethical values than we do. Is this something that comes across in your activity or the connections you have with people?
Of course, because I mean, many people still think that free software or open source. I would agree. It's the same. That you cannot make money out of it. You cannot make economic value out of free software, and these are still misconceptions that we face. So we often have to explain that the moral compass or the ethics behind it is not competing with the economic value behind it. So of course that's part of our work. When we are talking about moral values, I struggle a little bit with this word because it's really vague. What are values after all? Ethical values. But I'm deeply convinced that you can combine all of the economic value and the moral values with each other, because it's not working without each other. If a company is creating open source software, it doesn't really work without having the ethics in the background, or like the values of cooperation, values of sharing. And the former FSFE's president, Carsten Gerloff, once used a picture for that. He compared the different types of people using or doing free software. On the one hand, there are miners, people who are just using open source software but not contributing back to the community. And then there are farmers, people who grow free software, who give back and who collaborate in the community. And I think this shows that you can create economic value, but only with having the software freedom values in back of your mind.
Stefan.
Maybe I can comment about this. In my initial comment, I was speaking about values at the company level, so internal values and values as they are projected to your customer. But it's also important to think about shared value as an ecosystem, because in an ecosystem can strive only if the development is sustainable. If, as you said, there are miners that only grab value from the contributors and don't contribute back to the ecosystem, the ecosystem will or probably eventually die out. As an organization, CNLL, the Conseil National du Logiciel Libre, which I'm a co-chair in France, we've had, I think 5 or 6 years ago, an initiative called La Charte Libre Emploi, the Free Employment Charter, which has been signed by maybe 60 or slightly less than 100 companies in France, and it's focused on the some of these internal values. So it's a small, it's quite short, just 5 points, a small set of principles that every company that has signed this charter agrees to implement in the company. For instance, we allow our employees to use the development environment or the computing environment they wish. Because we know some companies that claim they are doing open source, but they tell their employees, you need to use the corporate Dell computer with Windows operating system. Maybe it's not so bad after all, but some developers really prefer to work with open source, to work with Linux or even BSD or other system. Another point was that this company must allow their employee to participate in open source communities. I know a big French company which uses a lot of open source software and explicitly forbids their employees to even show up in open source online communities because they fear that some other company will poach them up. So this is a set of very simple, actionable principles, and that are supposed to help our ecosystem to differentiate itself from other more general IT companies.
So there are mechanisms to make business open source compatible or open source values miscible within businesses. That's what you mean. We can reconcile some moral values or ethical values from open source that are at a certain level,
yes,
than the business that doesn't care about it.
Yes,
and make them both work together in resonance.
Yeah, there's another quite famous example. It's from the agile communities. They have a very small set of 4 different principles or values, people over process, working software over documentation, and so on. And from this set of values, there is a whole ecosystem, or how do you say in English, cottage industry of consultants or methodologies that have sprung out from just these 4 principles.
Okay. To change the topic, there was when I was preparing this, I came across some sayings, and one perspective is to say that software being everywhere in our lives, software being even controlling maybe our lives, or at least our security depends, and safety often depends on some software. And one of the greatest arguments in favor of open source is that if software is so critical in your life, you should be able to control it and to see what you have in it. But that is more in terms of a technical approach to software. But if I want to look at this value thing, because technical approach has no value at all, in fact, but if I want to look at this from the value thing, doesn't that mean that software being everywhere should be considered as, I mean, the road system or the air we breathe, like a common good? Would that work? Who wants to have a take on this?
So Lawrence Lessig wrote a book called Code once, and he coined the phrase, code is law. The law doesn't actually matter very much. What matters is the policies, and in the software era, the software that implements the law. And so your freedom depends on the facial recognition system that is spotting Cedric Thomas coming out of the underground in London is the software that will cause Cedric Thomas to be arrested by the police officer. And it doesn't really matter what the law says. You will get arrested if the facial recognition system identifies you as a criminal. And it will take you a lot of effort to get yourself released again, even if the software got it wrong. And so what matters to the citizen in day-to-day life is not so much the law. The law does matter because it is your ultimate recourse to correct errors. But what really matters is the code, because the code is expressing your freedom in day-to-day life. And consequently, I strongly believe that the code that could take away my liberty should be code that I have the freedom to study. I think that it is improper for code to control my liberty if I am unable to check that it is complying with the law. And so I think it is fundamental to society that any code which deals with the liberty of individuals should be public code, that it should be at the very least publicly readable. and almost certainly code that can be studied and to which I can make pull requests to correct its failure to implement the law properly. So I think this is a key issue. Now, this afternoon here in Paris, Benjamin mentioned it a little moment ago, UNESCO are launching software heritage. Software heritage is the Library of Alexandria for the software age. It is the public archive and vault where all software can be stored and retrieved and studied by civilization. I think it is profoundly important that we get every European government to put its public code into software heritage so that as citizens we all have a right to see it.
Okay. Max?
I would like to just build up on that. I find this example of the facial recognition really good because there we don't speak about economic value of open source or of software anymore, but here this is a political question, this is an ethical question. And this is where at least I experience that if talking to decision makers, to policymakers, we can now bring back the values of software freedom to this debate because yes, we have those laws that we can recognize faces in metro stations. But then there's the question behind it, how can we control it? How can we deal with the issues arising from that? And this is where we can bring a solution. And this is what I was talking today about public money, public code, that we have public code which can, as you said, publicly be assessed and understood. And so I think this is again, not a value question, but a values question.
Thank you. Robert and Benjamin.
Yeah, I just had a comment. I mean, another typical case of having code which directly affects our lives, making that public, of course, is voting machines. I mean, it's a very simple case. Can I trust the voting machine that it will actually count the votes? No, you can't trust it because the code is often secret. So you have absolutely no idea what's going on inside a voting machine. And it's been shown a number of times that they can often quite easily be hacked, right? And which you don't want. Yeah.
Benjamin?
Yes, I would say it's a very important point because we spoke about assets, software as assets, and the question was what is the value? It's easy for proprietary software because we just have to count on the number of patents. So it's more difficult regarding open source software, but when you're speaking about commons, it's something else. When it's another very interesting, I think, actual movement. Commons, some open source and free software are commons, and when companies or organizations or individuals build commons, they want to just to put some software or something out of the market. It's not an asset. It's something we are sharing. We are building together. We have a common governance about it, and free software is, I think, one of the key answers about how to build digital commons. From my own experience, when we thought about how to do artificial intelligence regarding law in France, we had a lot of private and public sector organizations which wanted to do it, and they said, okay, we can't do such database and such software alone. We have to do it together because we won't trust anyone. We don't trust ourselves, and we have to do it with other people. We have to just have a governance to be sure that we can trust such database and such results we will have. And I think when we speak about commons, it's another aspect about value, but software as an asset and software as a commons are two different things and very interesting.
Yeah, I think there's an evolution now noticed where it started with software being a concern for personal freedom, Stallman talking about personal rights. Simon, you did point out that these rights were on a personal basis, and then there's been an evolution with the growth of software and software eating the world. Now we have software as a social challenge, and all this software can become evil, and it's our responsibility as open source communities to make sure that this software does not become evil. At this stage, I'd like to open up the floor for the questions from the audience. You have probably things to say, things to share. I know there are a few entrepreneurs in the room. I know there are a few managers in the room. I know there are a few activists in the room. Can we have a microphone there? Oh, they're running out of microphones up there. No, there's one there.
Yes, so, I'm Ludovic from XWiki, and I want to rebound on something that Stefan said and mentioned success of open source. And I want to say, I think we're in a situation where we do see that there is success for open source. We have a massive amount of open source code. However, we also see a new situation in the last few years where we see more and more companies that are using open source competing with companies that are producing open source. And the companies that are using open source sometimes contribute, but they don't. They keep a specific piece that they don't contribute. And we can see that in the successes in the last few years, and we just saw one now with GitHub, the most successful ones seem to be the ones that are using massively open source, the cloud companies, for example, that are massively using open source. But there is a whole set of software for which we have this competition between those that contribute. So in the example of GitHub, we can say GitLab competes with GitHub, one that is contributing that little step more, and GitHub that is not contributing that step, massively using open source, but not contributing what they do on top of it. So how do you analyze this situation, and how can we do, and how can we control software? How can people control software if there is always a piece that is not going to be shared?
Okay, this is something where I've been. This is something I have experienced quite a few times as an entrepreneur, and also something that I have been trying a discussion that I'm trying to build with the various communities I've been involved with since the creation of the GTLL or the CNLR. I think there are two different situations. The traditional one, where you have an ecosystem with mostly software vendors and systems integrators. And in the open source ecosystem, the vendors can be individual for smaller components. They can be ad hoc organizations. It can be foundations, or they can be professional open source companies like JBoss or Cygnus Software or more recent similar companies. So these companies produce either small pieces or larger components that can be reused by systems integrator to provide service to usually large companies or government organizations. And what we try to do as a trade organization is to have all these players, and especially the players in the French ecosystem, to work together, to have rules for them so that the value is shared between the producers and the integrators. It's not easy because everyone, of course, wants to keep most of the value for themselves. So maybe the best way is to educate the customer, the end customer, and to have them understand that if they only work with one big system integrators, but they don't ask for them to really work in close partnership with smaller software vendors, the system is not sustainable. And then there is a new issue that you comment with your the GitHub example or many other examples, and it's the cloud provider, the SaaS, software as a service providers that are really using a lot of open source components and operating systems, web services, and components for their favorite programming language. But some of them, at least, don't contribute. There are some that contribute much more than others. I think a good example in Germany is Zalando, the fashion, is that right? Yes, a fashion e-commerce site, and they have an open source policy which can be an inspiration for other companies that want to implement a similar approach, and they are publishing some very interesting components. Of course, Google, Facebook, and so on are doing the same, but there are other issues with them that I don't have to comment, of course, and I leave the floor to the other speakers.
Thank you. Is there any other question? If there is no other question, there is one last question, and then we'll move on to final comments from our panelists. Unless you want to address this right now, Robert.
Just a slight comment to this. So open source software is free, but there is often a lot of work put into it, either by a private person or by a company. So the question, I think one important issue is to work out how can you compensate the providers of the open source that will keep doing it, right? I mean, yes, we have this set of values. We want to spread what we're doing. We feel we should do this, but it costs us, the providers, it costs us both time and money, perhaps, and things like this for it. So is there a way of providing it? Because sometimes you find companies that will take open source software, which is free, and then expect to be able to use it and have support for it as if they'd paid money for it. Right? They can come back to the provider and say, we want these features, then they'll come back a month later and say, why haven't you provided us with these features and things like this for it? Which is perfectly reasonable if it's software they're buying, but now they're just downloading it for free and come back with it. And so just getting back to the morals again of how we're doing this and what we're providing and what people expect we provide, and can we work out some reasonable way to compensate if you want to.
So it's a question of if you expect the developers to work for their ideal reasons, then how do you make the system sustainable?
How do you make it sustainable? How do you get the people using it also working for the same set of values, or accepting the same set of values and supporting that? And
right.
Yes, some companies do. I mean, this is not universal anyway, but some companies do and some companies don't.
We have a question there.
Yeah, not a question.
Or a comment.
Yeah, just a comment about this. This phenomenon, this thing is not new. People doing money without contributing, it's an old stuff. But my own experience about it is we need to push on marketing, because if you have, for example, the ILS world is ruled now by the open source, and this is done by having a lot of people marketing on the open source itself, going to the customers, explaining why we should pay more than the other companies, just because they make the things sustainable in long term. So if you want to by experience, if you want to fight those companies that doesn't play the rules, you have to fight by explaining the customers why they should play the rules.
Thank you. Okay, final comments, because we have a clock here, but in fact we need to finish before the clock hits 0. I've been told.
So this
whole for the panelists.
This whole discussion about whether open source can survive if no one pays, it is such an old discussion that is no longer relevant. The only people that it matters, the only projects it matters about are legacy projects like OpenSSL, where the developers working on it have, they live there from a previous era. And we've looked after many of the important ones through a project that is funding small projects like OpenSSL. But today, people are talking about GitHub. Well, I looked up what GitHub is made from, and GitHub has got a web page called Projects That Power GitHub. And if you want to make GitHub, pretty much everything GitHub does is an open source project. And it's an open source project that GitHub are contributing to and sustaining through their own developers or through contributions to foundations that work on the code. GitHub is not a taker from the open source community. GitHub is doing things the modern way. They are integrating the open source parts, and what they are monetizing is complexity. They are creating a complex system, and if you want to compete with them, you have to hire the skills and build the value system and create the complexity that matches theirs. And that's the reason the GitLab isn't a giant system. It's because they haven't done that. They haven't hired all the brilliant people. They haven't created the value ecosystem. They haven't cleverly created many reasons to participate. And so if you want open source to succeed today, what you do is you build a business that's built on open source. And there are many of those. There's companies like Facebook. Facebook is all built from open source. Google is all built from open source. And they contribute to the projects that they are built from. That when they make new things in-house, they release them as open source. That's where React.js came from. It was an internal framework in Facebook that they released to massive benefit to the world. So I think this whole conversation about people being net takers from open source is something that old guys like me think. It's not something that anybody under 30 thinks. In today's world, companies are combining many open source parts to create complexity that they monetize. And that's the future of open source.
That's a good point. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I think
briefly, Stefan.
Yes, of course.
And then the other companies.
One of the reasons these companies are behaving the way they are behaving is also because there is a shortage of talented developers. And so having the right values, as I said earlier, but also showing your expertise by having your own corporately sponsored project like React or Google's or Angular or other similar project from bigger companies is a way to attract developers, and it's also a way to bring a third-party ISV or VARs into your ecosystem. For smaller companies like mine, it's a bit harder. You mentioned also the influence of VC money before, and with VC money, it's quite easy to buy a community. You can buy, actually, on GitHub, you can buy fake stars and fake forks and fake, or at least, fake contributions. And when the customer uses these metrics as a way to evaluate or strongly your project perform, it becomes an issue.
I understand that. Who's next for the final comment? Max?
Yeah, sure. Final comment. Well, we spoke a lot about I found this comment quite interesting that we have this image of miners who are just using open source and free software and not contributing back. And I would add to that I encourage the people who are here in the audience to think about being free and open from the bottom to the very top. And I think this is really a marketing issue and something that we can bring up when speaking to people, that having free software and having inspectable software somewhere, that this is a huge benefit for users and for the customers. And I think we have to get better in advertising software freedom and the freedoms at all, and not just think of making money, but also thinking of creating a market for open source and free software where we can put these values in.
Thank you. Robert?
Well, I don't know if there's anything more to add from what I said. I mean, we are users of open source software. The company I work for, Erlang Solutions, that's based on open source software. Some of the things we do are open source, and some of the things are not, depending on our customers, our clients, what they decide. We definitely try and support if we can. As I said, I think this problem of getting support out is a serious issue. And yes, some companies do a lot of that, but there are a lot of just plain users. And if that doesn't go all the way, I think trouble for open source and free software. That's a problem that needs to be solved. I think there is a problem. Maybe I'm just being more pessimistic here.
Oh, thank you. Benjamin, one last word quick.
Yes, I would say we are all here convinced by open source advantages, and maybe the next step is, because open source is everywhere, we have to build bridges between people who are using and who are confident about open source, and other people who need to make money, who need to transfer technologies, or all this kind of stuff. Because we can work together, but we have to just find new metrics, new way of using open source in traditional, I would say, business development and all this stuff.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Well, it occurred to me that we've been talking about values and value, and as it happened, none of us has been talking for their own benefits, but for the common benefits. Because if we'd been in a proprietary world, and we know that now today in software there is a purely proprietary world does not exist, but say we'd been in a proprietary world with proprietary vendors, etc., we'd be talking not about values, but about company culture and shareholder value. And yet, we've not been doing this. We've been talking about values that we could all share together, not for our personal benefits, and more for the common good. So at least we are probably changing something. Thank you very much.